Assalamu alaikum students. The topic that we'll be doing today is Elizabethan poetry. This is in continuation of our previous lectures. हमने initially किया था Elizabethan era, followed by Elizabethan drama, Elizabethan prose, and this is the last part of that particular era, Elizabethan poetry. Coming to the Elizabethan age, girls, it was like we've already studied, and period of literary freedom, जहाँ पे बहुत ज़्यादा experimentation हुई within all domains, including poetry. And that was essentially because that the era before the Elizabethan era, there was a lot of tumultuous socio-economic events. Yani कि there was a lot of disturbance in the society, and now that political stability and social stability generally society may aaye, so people were more prone to experiment within the domain of literature and art. And therefore, like all other genres, poetry maybe there's a lot of imaginative work and a lot of innovative work that was being done. If we are to look at Elizabethan poetry and the general qualities जो Elizabethan poetry में थी, उसका first and foremost tenet था creativity. People and poets especially sort of had this creative spirit of doing something new, something that had not been done before. And for that, they used and experimented with the domain of language, especially through the use of metaphors referring to extended symbolism, जो repeatedly Elizabethan poetry में use होता था. And then there was repetition, यानी एक ही चीज को बार बार repeat किया. To what purpose it actually served, I will let you know in the next slide. And then puns, again, multiple meanings hote hain of certain words, using them in a certain context where it can have multiple meanings in order to bring in a more sort of in-depth um, uh, expression to a certain form of a poem. And then paradoxes, where two opposites exist in a certain domain in order to intensify a certain feeling or in order to bring about the complexity of a certain human emotion. Generally, metaphor Elizabethan poetry में किस purpose के लिए use हुआ? It was used generally in metaphysical poetry, जो कि एक certain kind of poetry थी which was written during the Elizabethan era, and metaphors were used generally to compare women to objects of rare and exotic beauty. यानी उस तरह के beauty के objects के साथ which were not very common, and these objects were compared to the beauty of a woman in order to sort of express the intensity of how beautiful a woman can actually be. Then repetition, जो Elizabethan poetry में exist करती थी, it was there to generally develop and deepen the theme of poetry. I'm sure you've read certain poetry where one line is repeatedly mentioned at the end of every stanza, or the last two lines are always mentioned at the end of every stanza in order to bring about the central theme of a poem. Then puns were also used in Elizabethan poetry in order to bring to force the multiple meanings that exist in a word within the domain of English language, and in order to illustrate the multiple meanings that the poets try to bring forth through their poetry. And of course, paradoxes, like I mentioned before, also were also used in the Elizabethan poetry in order to show the importance of opposites or complexity of human emotions and situations को and of course उनकी intensity को बताने के लिए paradoxes were used in Elizabethan poetry. When we come to the theme of Elizabethan poetry, what is it that it generally focused on? It focused on romance and courtly love. That is love, the intricacy or the sort of complexity of human love that existed at that point in time. And then romanticism, जो है उसका domain के अंदर जो certain ideals थे, which focused on human imagination, the level of human imagination and feeling that was explored through Elizabethan poetry. And then melodrama, focusing on the human emotion, was another facet of Elizabethan poetry. जो सबसे important aspect of Elizabethan poetry है that it is the time during which the sonnet as a form of poetry came into being. And the pioneer of this particular form of poem or poetry was Mr. Thomas Wyatt. And then, of course, Surrey being another one who tried to give it a certain rhyming meter, यानी उसकी जो क्या certain rhyme scheme है, or structural division, that how this particular poem should be divided. And the works of these two were published in Richard Tottel's Songs and Sonnets, a compilation of poems in 1557. Now, what exactly is a sonnet, girls? We need to know that before we sort of dwell on the different aspects of the sonnet, because sonnet predominantly as a typical style of Elizabethan poetry was developed during this era. Now, the sonnet is derived from the Italian word sonetto, which means a little song, and it is typically a form of poetry that has 14 lines written in a certain way, जिसे हम a certain rhyme scheme, which is known as the iambic pentameter. Or iski, each line has 10 syllables. Yani ke when you read in one line, you're able to divide the words into 10 syllables. And there is a specific rhyme scheme to it. So iambic pentameter is a certain way of writing a poem. And sonnet के अंदर वही specific way use होता है, and it is comprised of 14 lines. When we come to some of the most renowned poets of the Elizabethan era, the first one that we come across is Edmund Spenser. Edmund Spenser is probably the most famous poet of the Elizabethan times. And what is unusual about his poetry was that he combined elements of tragedy and comedy. And also, he put in a lot of imagination and intense emotions in his poetry. But his most famous poem is The Fairy Queen, which was written in honor of Queen Elizabeth I in order of a certain dynasty, यानी कि एक कौम की appreciation में लिखी गई थी, the Tudor dynasty, in celebration of that. And but primarily the purpose of the poem was that it was written in the honor of Queen Elizabeth. And like we know, Elizabethan era जो फ्लरिश किया, इट उसका प्राइमरी रीजन एक ये भी था that Queen Elizabeth did support literature and different domains of literature through her appreciation and through, of course, her financial assistance as well. Now, if we look at Spencer's style of poetry, why was he so famous? The reason was that he took in images from almost all domains of life, whether it was romances, whether it was love stories, whether it was tragic epics. He brought them all together in a beautiful manner in his own poetry and experimented them in different ways. And there is so much experimentation in his images that a lot of people feel that there is maybe not one single image that he has not experimented with. And a classical example of that is the Fairy Queen. And it is for this reason that till today it is ranked as about the greatest poetry of all times in English language. uh, Up Spencer, not just through his poetry and the variety of images and his amalgamation of different genres in poetry, he's not just famous for this, but he is also the originator of two main things, being the Spenserian stanza, yani a typical way of writing a stanza in a poem. uh, was originated by, he was the pioneer of a Spenserian stanza. And then he further experimented with the form of the sonnet and that particular way of writing a sonnet, which is remembered till today in accordance with his name, and it is called the Spenserian sonnet. Now, apart from The Fairy Queen, which of course remains popular till today, his other poems included The Epithalamion, Prothalamion, Ice and Fire. These are very few, there are so many other. But one thing that till today almost all critics sort of agree upon is the fact that Fairy Queen till today remains his most famous and critically acclaimed work. The second poet who gained immense popularity during the Elizabethan era was William Shakespeare. Um, William Shakespeare, essentially known as a dramatist, but he did write a lot of poetry as well. And his first work being a 1200 line poem, Venus and Adonis, which was published in 10 editions between 1594 and 1602. So this was one of his earliest publications, and of course, one of his best selling ones as well. But apart from that, Shakespeare wrote many sonnets as well. And he had a specific way of writing a sonnet, which was different from the other forms of sonnets. And he experimented further with a domain which is known as this Shakespearean sonnet. And it was a typical way of writing it. It comprised of three quatrains, यानी कि four lines में एक stanza divide. Quatrains refers to four lines, and three sections the of four lines each, and at the end of it there used to be two lines, that is a couplet. और इसकी rhyme scheme होती थी AB CD CD EF EF and GG, which was a certain rhyme scheme to it. So it was about three sections of four lines each, and at the end there used to be two lines which used to rhyme with one another. And this different sonnet structure allowed for more space, Shakespeare believed, and more way of expression as compared to the previous sonnet. And that is why this particular form of sonnet is remembered with the name of Shakespeare till today, and it is known as the Shakespearean sonnet. So Shakespeare's sonnets were poems that were written by him, obviously. And when we talk about it, he wrote about 154 sonnets, which were altogether put together in a quarto. Quarto is a certain kind of a book back in the Elizabethan era, which was very famous. A pamphlet भी उसे कह सकते हैं, book also, written in 1609. However, apart from these sonnets, he also wrote certain sonnets in some of his plays, which includes Romeo and Juliet, Henry V, Love's Labour Lost, and Edward III. So this is it, girls, about Shakespearean poetry. What you need to know about Elizabethan poetry is that it was again an era in which a lot of experimentation, a lot of imagination went into poetry. New forms of poetry were also pioneered. Jisme sonnet was the most famous, which was used not just by Edmund Spenser, but also by Shakespeare. And they expressed it in their own ways. And they put in their own innovation to the sonnet as well. And hence came forth the Spenserian stanza and the Shakespearean stanza. I hope you understand, girls, and continue working hard. And I hope we can do the very best out of our limited resources in these challenging times.